Hello, and welcome to Global Data Thematic Intelligence. We track over 100 tech, industry, ESG, and macro themes impacting all major sectors. My name is Eve Thomas, and today I will be talking to Andrew Charlton, Managing Director at Aviation Advocacy. Andrew was previously the Chief Legal Officer of Qantas Airways and was responsible for government affairs for the IATA and the CETA. He has experience across various aspects of the aviation industry and is joining us today to talk specifically about Boeing. Hi, Andrew. How are you?
I'm very well. Good to see you.
Thanks so much for joining us on our podcast today. To start with, it would be good to know some more about Boeing, which has found itself in the news recently for various accidents, including a door plug which fell off mid-flight and a loose external panel. Could you explain a bit more about the problems which Boeing is facing and how its disasters have been allowed to happen?
I think the door plug falling out, I think the problems with the 737, the problem with a couple of other things are merely the physical symptoms of what's going wrong inside Boeing, or perhaps, and I hope this is the case, what went wrong inside Boeing. Boeing needs no introduction. It's the largest company in the United States. It's one of the two major airframe manufacturers in the world. And let me say, as an aviation person, we need at least two really credible airframe manufacturers. So they're a really fundamental part of air traffic, air transport, aviation, and the safe delivery of aviation for travellers all over the world. The other issue to remember in all of that is that an airframe manufacturer is an enormous company. And I don't just mean that they employ a lot of people, but the capital needed, the expertise needed, the resources, the position you have to take, the hoops you have to jump through are so large that getting third, fourth, fifth competitors into the airframe market is really difficult. There are a couple of smaller companies, a Brazilian one, a Chinese one, that are trying to break into the market, but it is a very long and lonely road to hoe. So we need Boeing to succeed for the sake of the industry, for the sake of a competitive aviation industry. What went wrong with Boeing, I think it's fair to say, was that in the everlasting battle inside all companies between the experts of what it is that this company does and the bean counters who report and who set targets, financial targets, we went through a period where, driven by all sorts of what I think are now largely discredited theories about how you manage companies, driven by Jack Welch and that whole school of shareholder value. Unfortunately, acolytes of Jack Welch took over Boeing. They set incredibly challenging profit and cash flow, free cash flow targets, and forced the company to produce financial returns rather than quality aeroplanes. Once that happens, extra costs you build into triple checking what you're doing, double checking the triple checking, all that stuff falls away as unnecessary expenditure. And for those that can't see, I've just put in some air quotes there. The issue is, what do they do next? And we're now at a place where, having had extended the CEO, Dave Calhoun, and presuming that all was fine in the financial garden, all of a sudden the truth has come home with these recent accidents and a spate of whistleblowers and other things coming out showing that clearly things aren't good. And so Boeing is starting to turn the ship. But as I say, enormous company, takes a lot of time. But the single most interesting thing to look out for is the next generation aeroplane. Boeing is running on a 737, originally designed in the 60s, a 777, which was designed in the 90s, and the 787, which was designed in the early 2000s, so more than 2 decades ago. But the construction of which at the time had a lot of problems and I think scared a lot of people off. The decision Boeing has to make now is, what do they do to replace the 737, a small aircraft, a small to medium-sized aircraft, 150, 200-seat aircraft. Deciding you'll build a new aeroplane is a decision that's going to cost you about $50 billion. And until the disasters that came out recently, the board, I think, had decided that they weren't going to spend that money because they couldn't justify it in their free cash flow, shareholder value driven vision of the world. A disaster for travellers all over the world, because it means that perhaps Airbus takes over. And that's not a knock on Airbus. We just need competition. That's what we need. We need Airbus to be pushed to be as good as they possibly can be. We need Boeing to be a heck of a lot better than it currently is as an industry. And you as a traveller need that as well. Boeing have said now, I think, that they're setting $50 billion aside, but first they have to replace the CEO. That's obviously a complicated and very difficult decision, and it won't be taken quickly. It'll be taken a lot quicker than I think had originally been intended with Dave Colloon and his departure. But nevertheless, we're not going to see exciting change at Boeing until we've got a new CEO. Arguably, that is exciting change. So that was an extraordinarily long answer, but I hope I've sort of covered off a few bases there.
Boeing has had a turbulent journey then, both physically and metaphorically. To what extent do you think the company's leadership and governance is responsible for some of the problems that we've talked about?
Well, I think it's fair to say in any company at all times, leadership starts at the top, doesn't it? I think you can't not sheet home the blame. And blame, I think, is the right word. You can't not sheet home the blame to the management structure.
That's great, thank you. And Boeing will, of course, be hoping for brighter skies ahead. But what do you think needs to change if the company is to steady its course?
Well, I think for a start, they need to go back to building really good aeroplanes and focusing on building really good aeroplanes. I think they're caught in a bind. They have outstanding orders for lots and lots and lots of aeroplanes, which means they've got to be produced quickly. As I say, that's enormously expensive, that process. But of course, as their order book is falling off because of the current problems they're having, they're going to have to gear up enormously and then come to something of an abrupt stop. They'd be better off focusing on the quality, though, and pushing the aeroplanes out at a more regulated pace, but in a pace that everyone can be comfortable with. That's step one. I think then step two is they absolutely need to gird their loins, suck up their courage, and make a decision on a new airframe. And that's a huge decision, and I'm not disputing that. But it's worth remembering, Eve, that in the 50s and 60s, the original Mr. Boeing, Winfred Boeing himself, bet the company on building the 747, the jumbo jet. He had a launch customer in the shape of Pan Am, and Pan Am arguably bet its company on the success of the 74. But the 747 was an epoch-making aeroplane, absolutely a changing aeroplane. But it was made by people who were prepared to be brave, and it's the bravery that is going to need to come back. Obviously, you don't want to be stupid brave, but you want to be real brave. You want to be sensible brave. But frankly, Boeing can't go forward in its civil aircraft area unless they announce and build a new airframe. It's going to have to include enormously different airframe material, things like that, to be lighter. It's going to have to be sort of a generational leap change, if you like. It's probably going to have to incorporate new generation engines, some of which we're not even sure we know about yet. Most of the efficiency, most of the cost efficiency, and of course emissions efficiency in aviation comes from the propulsion, comes from the engine, not from the airframe, but there are savings in the airframe as well. But the aircraft has to accommodate the new engines, which I think are going to be significantly larger, open rotor perhaps even, which will be both quieter and more fuel efficient and therefore less emissions. But they are going to need to build an aircraft that is future-proof, if you like. That's not easy. I'm not trying to... It's not a question of flicking a switch and bringing in a couple of kids from university who are real good at CAD design or anything like that. It's going to be a seriously complicated task. But if a company as large and as credentialed as Boeing can't do it, then we should all maybe just give up.
That's really interesting to hear. Considering the broader picture, do you think that any of Boeing's problems are indicative of wider issues in the aviation sector?
Oof, how long have we got? I think the first and most important point to note is that even as we speak today, whilst the industry is talking about lowering its emissions and being more fuel efficient, we're continuing to sell what, let's face it, we can only describe as current generation, certainly not new generation aircraft. We are at that stage in aviation in the discussion about sustainability. You know, the stages of grief. I think in sustainability there are stages, and we're at the stage of technological evangelism or technological saviorism, if you like. The technology is going to save us. There's no question technology will have a role to play, and Boeing will have to play very deeply in that field, as indeed must Airbus and all the other airframe manufacturers. Whether it's moving to electric aircraft or hydrogen-propelled aircraft or whatever. Or maybe we go back to airships. They were very low emitting airframes. But Boeing has a huge role to play in that. It also, of course, the fact is that at the moment, notwithstanding COVID, and passenger numbers are pretty much back to where we were in 2019, the industry is growing at a remarkable rate. And so we will need more airframes. I think we'll need new generation airframes, not existing generation airframes. And they'll need to be better and better and better. And they sure as hell aren't allowed to fall out of the sky. So that's a really fundamental point.
Thank you so much for all of your insights today, Andrew. We're nearly at the end of our time. But before we go, could you tell us, do you think that Boeing will ever be allowed to fail?
Oof, too big to fail. Frankly, my view, no, it never will be allowed to fail because I think the US economy depends on it too much. We saw with the car industry in the Obama administration, they weren't allowed to fail. I think it's very hard to believe that Boeing will be allowed to fail. Remember, too, that 35%, 40% of Boeing's business is defence. And of course, the US has some fairly firm views on defence. So I just don't think Boeing will be allowed to fail. That it's not allowed to fail doesn't mean that it shouldn't be bloody good.
Great. Well, that's all the discussion we have time for today. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your insights on Boeing's problems and your thoughts on the wider implications of the company for the aviation sector. It's been a really great opportunity to get a better understanding of why Boeing has been so prominently in the news recently. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And from us in Thematic Intelligence, see you next time.